Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending today's MRI Professional Development webinar series. We're going to give it a few minutes and let people join before we get started, so just hold tight. Okay, so we're going to get started, and they'll make people start trickling in. There's about 200 registered, so should be a full house. So thank you for attending our 5th MRIA Professional Development webinar series, or our webinar in the series. And today we will be discussing Troubling Times or Golden Age, Leadership 360. We have Zainab Aydin from Research Strategy Group, and she will be discussing Are Leaders Born or Created? Dr. Ada Lee from BWorks, Why Leaders Need to Shift Their Mindset and Become Scientific Thinkers. And Lisel Douglas, Accountable Leadership, will be bringing accountability to the forefront. She'll be discussing bringing accountability to the forefront. Now, before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. So the overall development of this webinar series, we were really focused on bringing Canadian content to MR pros with innovative topics, support for research professionals and clients. And to that end, we've created the professional forum and social forum to continue the conversation today. So you'll have a link after the event with a link of this webinar, but also to the forum. And the social forum, hopefully get some digital networking going and potentially even create your own event. And upcoming webinars, we have Automation Diaries in September, Big Tech, Small Tech, and Future Intelligence in October, and Entrepreneurship in MR, that's in November. Now, it's not listed here, but if you are looking to get certified, we have the CMRP exam coming in October, and there's also an option if you have 8 years or more, you can forego the exam and have a more a written example and evaluation as opposed to the exam. But I won't waste any more time. I'll hand it off to Zaydeen. I want to thank everybody for joining, and stick around after. There will be some, if you have any questions, write them in the chat. And Arundhati Dandapani, who's with me today, she will be asking the questions to the hosts. I mean, not the hosts, the speakers. But thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dan. Well, hello, I'm Zainab Aydin from Research Strategy Group, and I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank the MRIA for this opportunity to reflect, share, and interact with colleagues. The MRIA is a deeply rooted community, and I'm happy to see that it's still going strong. So, here's my take on leadership and what it requires. I want to stress that no success can happen in a vacuum. Nothing can be achieved in isolation. Every major undertaking requires a team, and where there's a team, there has to be Sherpas, mentors, coaches, and leaders. A vaccine to counter COVID-19 cannot be developed without leadership. We need leaders to navigate the economic downturn that awaits us after the pandemic. Leaders are those people who shoulder responsibility for the success of others. They nurture talent and take pride in the lifelong achievements of the people they have mentored. So, how do you find these leaders? Can you grow them from scratch? Or are they born as leaders and waiting for you to discover them? Instinctively, I think the human mind is geared to favor the idea that some people are cut out to be leaders. However, that's only half the truth, as there are many coachable soft skills that being a leader necessitates. Many of those are gained on the job by taking on a stream of gradually increasing responsibility. Most leaders are made by hard work, resilience, and self development. We also tend to think of leaders as superhumans. It is true that leadership has a lifestyle component and takes discipline because the leader sets an example and defines the standards for the rest of the team. In addition to that, the obligation to engage with the most serious and urgent issues in the organization and being the designated bad cop at times all bring a burden of stress. So, leadership is undeniably a tough spot in which to be. However, robots don't make good leaders. Authenticity and vulnerability are essential qualities of a leader who can inspire others to be their best self. The leader is not only deeply human and flawed, but also transparent about their own shortcomings. There is no such thing as a perfect human being, nor a perfect leader. There are different leadership styles, and a leader's performance is variable over time and dependent on context. The knee jerk or conventional approach to leadership is to look for a charismatic personality, just as taller athletes are favored as basketball players. Recently, I have read or rather listened to The Undoing Project, a biographical book by Michael Lewis that chronicles the background in which Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have hatched their ideas on behavioral economics. This famous duo has proven again and again that stereotypes can cloud our judgment severely. In fields as disparate as basketball, the military, or even in medicine, gut decisions in selecting people or predicting success can lead to very suboptimal outcomes. Coincidentally, Tversky was the more charismatic half of this duo, but Kahneman was the main source of most of their shared ideas. The best performing leaders are not the loudest ones. On the contrary, they are the finest examples of servant leadership. All the more reason to make leadership not a prize to be won, but a responsibility that is shared. We could take inspiration from flocks of migrating birds. Canada geese, ducks, and swans commonly form a flying group in V formation. The V formation improves the aerodynamic efficiency of flying birds over long migration routes, not unlike the journey of a team or a company. The birds flying at the front are rotated in a timely cyclical fashion to spread flight fatigue equally among the flock members. When one leader starts to get tired, another team member steps up to the role, thus securing direction and safety for the flock. Another helpful paradigm is game theory. If a leader sees their career as a finite game, then their approach will be more transactional, based on short term wins. This is an extremely limiting and stifling view of leadership. Instead, imagine that your career is an infinite game. Your lifetime legacy is more important than your everyday wins or losses. As you advance in your career, you also build a trusted team who can be life changing at critical points in your journey. This is actually the growth mindset applied to an ecosystem of professionals. In this regard, I can't think of a better ecosystem for a brand builder or a marketing professional than a team of strategists and insights professionals. We may not have all the answers, but we sure as hell know how to get you the answers. As you may know, it has been uncovered that the human body is a biome that is colonized by resident microorganisms. In numbers, These microorganisms that inhabit us are estimated to be several times more numerous than the number of cells in our body. Just another example that in nature, nothing happens in isolation. Practically every undertaking in nature involves an interconnected web of cooperation. This also applies to business and our careers as well. It is unnecessary, exhausting, and counterproductive to try to achieve your goals as a one-person show. The equivalent of a biome in the context of a career is a network or a community of people who have experience working as a team and whose skills you can trust and use where appropriate. So, the bottom line of all this is to use the hive mind or collective intelligence to create outstanding results. You have to build a connected ecosystem of individuals whose skill sets you know intimately. Use every occasion you get to road test their capabilities. Ask yourself, who do I know? Who can I call? Who has done brilliant work? Who knows exactly what they're talking about? And who do I trust to deliver the highest caliber results? This habit or lifelong preparation is the only formula that will make you resilient in times of crisis. Instead of being transactional and chasing the short-term win, build a community and build a legacy. Only then can you truly fulfill the mission of a superhero. Thanks for listening. And now I would like to pass the mic to my colleague Dr. Ada Lee.
Thank you, Zainab. I'm going to advance the slide. All right. So thank you again. My name is Ada, and I'm the Director of Ideation and Design Lab at BEworks. We are a consulting firm that specializes in the application of behavioral science to organizational and business challenges. And today I would like to share with you some thought starters on how we as leaders can adopt a new way of thinking today. Now, I want to start off with a provocative statement that generally there are two things that we as leaders, as change makers, do not do enough of. Now, the first thing is recognizing that humans are not robots. I think that's, quite obvious. We all know that humans are not robots, but what we don't fully recognize is that the human mind is actually incredibly complex. And correspondingly, human behavior is incredibly complex. And these humans, of course, are your customers, your stakeholders, employees, constituents, family, friends. And what we see time and time again is that although we recognize that humans are complex, we act as if they are not. And we assume that, if we give people the right information, the right incentives, the right education, that they will behave accordingly. And time again, we are surprised when people don't act in the way that we expect, right? So think of, for example, the current efforts to get people to comply with mask wearing or social distancing. Or think about how long of a journey it has been to try to reduce smoking behaviors in the general population. Stop littering, recycle more, exercise more, eat better, shop responsibly, save for retirement, reducing employee absenteeism, increasing employee motivation, productivity, satisfaction, the list goes on. And I'm sure you already have in your mind by now about a situation where you try to make a behavior change in others, but much to your surprise, what you thought would work didn't end up working at all. So if humans aren't robots, and we know this, then the question is, what does it mean to be human? Now, the science of leadership goes hand in hand with behavioral science, because after all, the people we lead are humans. And so it's crucial and it's critical that we ask ourselves these key questions. How do we reason and make decisions? How does our sense of morality affect our sense of justice and fairness? How do our feelings guide our behavior? And how do other people shape our behavior? How do we view authority? Which ones should we trust and comply with? Which peers do we aspire to be like? Whose opinions do we care about? And who do we look for guidance? How do our individual perceptions shape the way we see the world? How do we see time? How do we see risk? Now, these questions are important to ask because as a behavioral scientist, I truly believe that the most impactful change that leaders can make comes from truly understanding the human mind. And it's time for all of us to move past the band-aid strategies that don't truly address root issues in human behavior. And it's my belief that the next turning point for leaders in business and government is to invest in evidence-based solutions that address the psychological and behavioral barriers that we've all ignored for far too long. So hopefully by now, I've intrigued you. Maybe I've even stressed you out a little. And you're probably sitting there wondering, how can you get started with this new way of thinking today? Now, 10 minutes does not provide a lot of time to cover all the essentials, but in what follows, I hope to share some thought starters. The first thing I want to point out, and excuse my heresy, is that relying on our intuition about how humans behave is not good enough. Now, let me show you why that is. The problem with our own intuition is that it's muddied by the faults of our own mind. What do I mean by this? The human mind is not perfect. It's not a machine. Our mind is designed to be efficient, and it usually operates by the rule of good enough. If it's good enough, then it's fine. Just move ahead, right? So most of the time, this works well for us. In the morning, I don't need to open up an Excel sheet and weigh all the pros and cons every time I make a decision to brush my teeth or lock the door, or put on my shoes. Our mind uses certain heuristics or mental shortcuts to help us make quick decisions. But the problem with this is that these mental shortcuts don't always work. And this is where we can have errors in judgment. For instance, we know that our memory system is not perfect. And actually, rather than our memory being kind of like a recording, it's actually, our memories are actually reconstructed every time we recall something. And we're also more likely to recall information that's most salient in our memories. So if you've ever gotten into an argument with someone, you know, how often has it been that you both remember something about the past event differently, and you're just arguing till veins are popping out in your neck? The other thing is that our minds naturally and automatically seek to remember information that is consistent with our initial beliefs. And this is known as the confirmation bias. You know, I have a friend who works for a very large marketing company. And one day, you know, she received a call from a local nonprofit organization. And she thought, it's a nonprofit. This means they must be asking for money. This is what I know about nonprofits. They're always looking for money. And funny enough, the moment that they mentioned something about money, she felt that her initial belief was confirmed. And she just stopped listening. She started to come up with ways to end the call. And what I asked her about this situation is, you know, did you maybe miss an opportunity? You know, maybe the organizer or you know, this nonprofit needed help with their marketing, or maybe another service that your firm provides, or maybe they could give you leads to other customers. And so, you know, this confirmation belief got in the way of her, you know, perhaps, you know, making the best of the situation and making a change to her organization. Some other problems with our minds that we have are, you know, we have a tendency to see patterns where none exist. You know, this is kind of the root cause of why we have stereotypes in the world. And if something doesn't fit into a pattern, we're motivated to change our interpretation so that this thing will fit into our belief system. And funny enough, the more of an expert that we become, the less we are able to think about an issue from an alternative perspective. And the list goes on. So the problem with relying on intuition to make our leadership decisions is that our intuition is not reliable. Because of the flaws of our own mind, we can have flaws in our intuition about what will work and what won't. Now, we can combat the faults of our intuition with scientific thinking. And I would argue that one of the forefronts of leadership science today is to employ scientific thinking into leadership decision-making. So what is scientific thinking, and how can you start adopting it today? So here are some tips. Number one, understand and know what your biases are. So we covered some of that today, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Just know that there's actually a lot more about our minds. The second thing is to occasionally deliberately play devil's advocate to your own ideas. We call that assumption reversal. So if you have an idea, a set of assumptions that you're making, force yourself to do the activity of assuming the opposite, just for a moment. What would happen if your assumptions were reversed? What would be true? And how would that change your idea? Now, if you have a strong hypothesis about what might work to change customer or employee behavior, what are some alternative hypotheses that could also be true? And the third thing is to acknowledge when your perspective is an intuition versus when it's evidence-based. So how to do this? Now, here, I'm trying to make some rough delineations about how we should express ideas that are based on intuition, experience, or evidence. So for instance, intuition, something that we talked about already, it can be very helpful, but sometimes it can lead us astray. The language to use when you know that you're talking about an intuition that you have, a gut feeling that you have, is to preface your idea by saying, it is my intuition that. If it's based on experience, especially if you've been in the field for years and years and you accumulated a lot of knowledge that way, you can preface your ideas by saying, in my experience, I think that X, Y, Z. When you actually have evidence in its most valid and reliable form, say from scientific experiments or through testing, you can preface your ideas by saying, it is my hypothesis that X, Y, Z, or if you have data to support your idea, evidence suggests that X, Y, Z. Now, try using this language when you're discussing concepts or ideas with the people around you, and not just in the scientific enclave that we've created here in this 10 minutes, but try it out in your work with your friends or even at home with family. You'll find that once you begin to speak in this manner, you'll naturally crave the data that will help test and validate your hypotheses. And by changing the way you speak, you'll automatically be able to turn your assumptions and intuitions into hypotheses that you can test. In an ideal world, as part of scientific thinking, if you are able to, you can take it to the next level and test your hypotheses. Gather some data, conduct some tests to validate or disprove your hypotheses. For example, maybe you believe that your employees would be more productive if you give them verbal compliments on a regular basis. Alternatively, maybe you believe that giving them small gifts would make the employees more productive. You may choose to randomly assign these employees to two groups, where one group receives the verbal compliments and the other group receives the small gifts. And then you can track whether there are any changes to their productivity, and if so, by how much. And that's just an example of something you could do. Now, I want to end this talk with encouraging everyone to start adopting scientific thinking today, something that I'm very passionate about. And I want to propose that it's really time to think about, to rethink how we think about science. Science is not a job, it's a way of thinking. And in these unprecedented, uncertain times, science is what we need, it's what leaders need to rely on to help us navigate a new normal. Thank you, everybody. And now I will pass the mic over to Lizelle Douglas.
Good day, everyone. My name is Lizelle Douglas, and I'm the founder of Accountable Leadership. We're a consultancy and advocacy firm here in Ottawa, created to drive change in leadership culture toward prioritizing positive human outcomes in political or corporate decision-making and policy creation. The intent is making accountability the foundation of leadership and prioritizing an accountability mindset. Today we're discussing how and why that might be done and its relationship to human crisis, human outcomes, and how research can play a role in accountability. So first off, defining accountability, we need to define it. How do we do that and why? So like many concepts that exist, it can be a very general thing, high level thing that applies in every situation, but there are also the situational elements that arise out of that general concept. So in academia, in management literature, there are general definitions of accountability and the components that exist. And there are also situational elements that might arise in various crises or in our day-to-day context, depending on the industries where we work. Now, accountability, typically when we hear about it, we hear about how leaders or bosses can encourage or institute accountability in their workplaces or employee accountability. Sometimes we hear about leadership accountability, but it tends sometimes to not be very tangible. We tend in society to assume goodness or morality of an individual as enough of an indicator as to how they may approach things and what outcomes we can expect from them. We tend to also admire our leaders for their taste or their style, their approach, even though sometimes those approaches don't lead to great outcomes for the people they work with or the people who are affected by their decisions on a regular basis. So one of the other things that tends to happen is we talk a lot about accountability as a means to punish or blame someone once a crisis or a disaster or some situation has already arisen. As you can see with COVID-19 and with what happened in Beirut today, sometimes post-accountability is a bit late, and what we really want to know is how can we have leaders who will do what needs to be done to offset these kinds of outcomes. So we don't hear a lot about the before, the pre-crisis aspect of accountability. So defining it, I'm going to go to a quote from Eric J. McNulty and Leonard Marcus, who are founding directors at the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative at Harvard. And they say, leading involves guiding people to the best possible eventual outcome. So it's about outcomes and creating those outcomes. And the focus needs to be on what is likely to come next and readying to meet it, seeing beyond the immediate to anticipate the next 3, 4, or 5 obstacles. So when we're talking about crises, we can see the link here because sometimes a disaster or crisis occurs and it's entirely unpredictable, but a lot of times it's the result of negligence, or perhaps there was someone who didn't think that something was important enough to deal with beforehand. Putting accountability that learns to put people at as the priority would seek to anticipate these outcomes to offset these risks. So why is it fundamental? Why is accountability fundamental to leadership and crisis? As mentioned, sometimes or many times, leadership accountability is not very well defined. We assume that goodness or morality is enough, and we take for granted that a leader will fall into the general norms that the very vague norms that exist that others have followed, even though it's not prescribed anywhere. So some of the features that we see is a lack of foresight or anticipation, and not necessarily seeing anything wrong with lacking that foresight. Deprioritization, devaluation, and denial of evidence or of advice from experts, forewarning certain scenarios or dictating how to handle certain scenarios, lack of pre-planning or readying, little guidance or strategy to inform how others might approach the situation, divestment rather than ownership. So a lot of finger pointing, saying, well, you're not doing what you're supposed to do, and you're not doing what you're supposed to do, so how do you expect me to do what I'm supposed to do? Rather than looking for ways to unify and facilitate a solution. And one of the key things is only chaotic outcomes or chaos, or when something has become out of control, does it spur a movement towards placating or solving problems for people. And this is not true people-centered leadership. It is more like playing a game of whack-a-mole. How can I get rid of this problem right now? But it's not an approach that sees problems before they happen and seeks to offset them, or that puts people at the forefront and considers itself to be accountable to those people. So in order to talk about leadership accountability and what that should look like and what that could look like, and we need to talk about what we want. And in order to talk about what we want or what outcomes we want, we need to design, prescribe, and evaluate. We need to identify and measure certain variables. So, for example, when it comes to crisis, we know that there are certain outcomes that, in general, that we want to avoid. And especially when you go into academics on crisis management and go to crisis management authorities, they have those prescriptions written down as to what kind of outcomes for people we want to avoid, so that society as a whole can navigate, a leader can navigate society through that crisis, or a leader can offset that crisis. So part of the role that research can play and information can play is understanding how our decisions affect other people, understanding how crises can affect people, identifying the people outcomes that we want, identifying the behaviors and values that would lead to creating those outcomes. So in terms of research sources and how we can go about identifying that, quite honestly, there's a lot of secondary research in terms of various industries and scenarios and contexts that we can go to find out, well, what are the negative outcomes for a particular group of people, or what are the outcomes for a particular crisis. So, for example, even though COVID-19 came upon us sort of unexpectedly, it wasn't something in terms of pandemic. Pandemic scenario is not an unpredictable scenario, and it's not something where we don't know when one is managed well or when one is not managed well, how it will affect a particular population. So it's something that there's information that a leader can use to formulate a plan. Additionally, that would inform a pre-approach. There's also a qualitative approach that you can use retroactively. So let's say this crisis is over, we can talk with leaders to find out, well, how do you see yourself accountability-wise in terms of what you could have done or could not have done to facilitate a better outcome, and what can be done better next time. This sort of information doesn't just inform leaders, it informs us as a society in terms of knowing what we can expect of our leaders, and not necessarily accepting things like, well, this kind of came out of nowhere, so no one could have seen this coming, or no one else could have possibly handled it better, when that's not necessarily true, and these are sort of divestment statements. We can also do qualitative research to find out, well, how did the handling of this particular scenario affect the people who, unfortunately had to go through it because no one prevented it, even though it was preventable, or even though it could have been, the outcomes could have been reduced. So these are different ways that we can use a variety of different research sources to inform an accountability mindset from a leader perspective, and also to inform what we expect from a leader as a society and an organization. So in the next few slides, I've sort of, in a very, I would say, informal way, looked at COVID-19 and some of the things that we've seen across, the globe, and from leaders and, outcomes that we have observed that perhaps were negative or positive, and some of the behaviors that we saw that either facilitated these outcomes. And this also sort of shows a way that we can mentally map out these variables. This is not, as a warning, this is not an index or anything like that has been created, although that sounds like a really good idea. But it is a way for us to think about how we can use research to identify the outcomes we want, the values and behaviors that will contribute to having leadership that reduces the risks and the negative outcomes for our society. So you may know that Jacinda Ardern is one of the leaders right now in the world that many people think or regard as having a lot of the qualities that offset risks, make people feel calm. She is very communicative and open and exemplifies transparency. So one of the things that I read in a lot of literature about calm and eliminating panic or reducing panic is communicating in a way that supports actions. We're not communicating after something bad has happened and saying, well, something good actually happened, or it wasn't that bad. We're actually doing things and communicating what's being done, and we're communicating when things do go wrong. We say, well, something did go wrong, and this is why. So communication supports actions. It acknowledges risks. It acknowledges the negatives and the drawbacks, but it still talks about why perhaps we need to continue on that path or why we need to move to a different path. And it outlines a strategic plan. So I've sort of broken down on the slide, what the outcome is: reassurance and a sense of security, because your leader is open and honest, and this allows people to trust their leader and have less panic about what's going on. So Andrew Cuomo is the governor of New York, and he's one of the leaders that people have again felt handled the situation very well. Although I think one of the situations that we see unfolding in the United States right now is a lot of division, and so part of what we want during a crisis is, unity versus people doing whatever and feeling like if I do that, then it's going to impact me and I'm not going to help that person because if I wear a mask for that person, then it's going to affect my freedom and these kinds of things. Leaders that unite eliminate these issues, who communicate and plan and strategize in a way that eliminate these issues, create unity in society. And so what the outcome would be is there are factions and there are interest groups that exist, but they don't believe that if I do X for someone else or that it impacts me. And one of the things that Andrew Cuomo did very well, he was very clear and very consistent, which is also good for unity because people need to know what path to follow versus, saying one thing, doing something else, saying you should wear a mask, not wearing a mask, things like that. But one thing he didn't do very well was he was very dismissive about a subset of the population that is very independent and does not like the idea of relying on the government. And it's not too hard to understand, when you look at some things that happen on the government's watch that people may not trust as well, and may want to take things into their own hands. And one of his press conferences, he was very flippant and very, dismissive about it. And as you can imagine, that wouldn't have been very helpful for trying to herd everyone into one goal or one mission. So one of the last one that I identified, which is, I'm sure there are others, but empowerment versus desperation. If we're going to ask people to take certain actions as leaders, then we also have to be empowering them to do it. So it's not just a matter of, am I a good person or a bad person, but it's how are you enabling people to actually take the steps that you are prescribing. And so do people have the time and the money? Are they actually getting the payments? I know that there are issues in various countries where people are not actually getting the payments that the government is saying that they're providing. So there are those issues. Is it convenient to be able to make use of these resources? So a large part of being a leader and facilitating the outcome of people being empowered to do the right thing and not feeling desperate and like they have to go, set fire to things, is actually enabling people to take care of their situation, and also to know that the typical ways of instituting accountability, like voting, actually work. So moving forward, what we encourage is that organizations begin to actually look at their leaders and ask, well, how are we actually prescribing our leaders' approach to how they take care of their employees, how they take care of even customers, people outside, the general public, stakeholders, and in politics, how are our political leaders acting in ways that prevent crisis for the general public? So we encourage that organizations, do culture audits, which can, comprise a number of research methodologies, like in-depth interviews and surveys, and even just looking at your performance agreements and things like that to see, well, we were saying that this is who we are with relation to people, but what are we actually doing? And how are our leaders actually exemplifying that? It's when there's also looking at, after a crisis has happened, well, how did we manage that crisis? How did that leader manage that crisis? Did that leader really, in terms of avoiding, were there ways that leader could have avoided that crisis? And when that crisis did arise, how did that leader take accountability for everyone who was going to be impacted in that? How did they adapt themselves? How did they adapt strategy? Things like that. And then there is the designing. So we need those outcomes. We need to identify what those outcomes need to be. We need to identify those behaviors and those values, and figure out, well, what sort of behavior works for us, for our situation, for our industry, or for our company, or for our society. So that's the end of my presentation, but it was very enlightening for you. These are things that we do with our with accountable leadership. And if you have any questions prior to after this is over, you can feel free to use the email at the end of the slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Liesl, Zainab, Ada, for that deep dive into leadership insights. And thank you to all those listening for still staying with us. If you have any questions, please post them into the chat. And if you don't get to them in this session, we will get to it after. For now, the first question is for Zainab. What is your take on inherited rule, whether in corporate companies, organizations, or in politics? Were there any good dynasties, and what made their rule effective? Zainab?
Okay, interesting question. Okay, so a succession pattern that you can call a dynasty is often found in family-owned and controlled companies. And those are nonetheless wildly successful, as in the examples of BMW, Ford, Volkswagen. Those are still family-controlled companies. And second, there's a meritocracy at play, where even if you're a family member, you still have to prove yourself worthy of leadership. And it's just, I guess, a narrower pool of talent, but not necessarily worse than other companies.
Not sure what happened there, but
Hello?
can you hear? Okay, so you're back? Okay.
The next question is for Ada. Scientific thought, as you've outlined, is methodical but takes time and investment, even as the benefits are long-term. How do you find clients struggling to invest in the entire scientific way of thought, and what are the trade-offs that they're making between true rigor and research outcomes and imperfect decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you're absolutely right that the adoption of scientific thinking, or the scientific method more specifically, can take time and investment. And, going to the final mile will give you the full benefits of adopting science. For instance, conducting experiments to test your hypotheses. But I would say that, the most critical thing is to simply get started. Getting started on the lower investment pieces as a way in. For instance, just simply changing the way you speak about your intuition versus experience versus ideas that are evidence-based, and really being the one, at the table to reframe people's competing arguments and their assumptions into hypotheses that can be tested against each other. And I think that's a game changer, and it's a very good starting point. It's changing the dialogue, the conversation of, maybe arguments at the table about who's right and who's wrong. It's all in the spirit of, these are all hypotheses that we can examine and test and collect data on. And being able to get to the point of doing actual hypothesis testing, especially in well-designed experiments, it's something that we do help our clients with, using what we know from the scientific literature to prioritize which hypotheses do and do not require testing. So, some hypotheses, for instance, already have so much mounting evidence that the solution works. I would say that those are the just do it's. And then really prioritizing the hypotheses that absolutely require testing. And that gives you the laser focus and streamline needed for testing, so that you can reduce the time and the investment needed. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is for Liesl. Trust in leadership, you say, is reliant on how...
Sorry to break in there. Liesel's having a problem. She was bounced out, but we sent her an email. She's trying to get back in. So just give me a sec, or do you have a more broader question for the other two?
Move on to the next for...
Sure.
The next is for Zainab. Hi, Zainab, are you there? What is the role of a follower
Yes.
or support group? Sorry, what is the role of a follower or a support group?
Sure. Okay. So when you say a follower, I will define that as being a team member, if that's okay. I would say that the most important contribution that a team member can make for the team is the energy that they bring. That should be devoid of complaint, excuses, and so on. And B is to be brutally honest with the leader when they see room for improvement. If you avoid contradicting your leader because it makes your life easier, I think that this is a disservice to the team. And finally, team members have to be prepared to shoulder leadership when required, as illustrated by the B formation example.
Thank you. I see Liesl is back, so may I ask her the next question? Liesl,
Yeah, sure, I'm here. I got kicked out somehow.
So trust in leadership, you say, is reliant on how well a leader's motivations and actions are aligned and understood, and increases the more data and research they use. How do accountable leaders overcome cultural divides or knowledge gaps, perhaps?
I don't explicitly say that trust necessarily increases the more we use research and data to make decisions. Although, you know, I'm sure it's a good thing if you like Andrew Cuomo have those presentations, those daily press conferences where you have your data and everything. But I actually recall when I used to work for Canada Revenue in public opinion research that we had determined somehow that showing people a lot of data didn't actually help them trust us more. But anyway, but I will say that if a leader uses research and data to make decisions, they're more likely to make a decision that is going to impact the people they're trying to serve, or the people who are going to be impacted more positively, because they'll be better equipped, and the strategy will be better aligned with the needs that need to be met. So I do say in my presentation that leaders should have an anticipatory mindset toward problems, to avoid crisis, learn from mistakes in the past, and be inclusive. And in order to do those three things, you have to have information, right? You have to have data. You have to know what happened before. You have to know how it was handled. You have to know what the outcomes were. You have to know, in order to be inclusive, you have to know about the people that you want to be inclusive toward and what their experiences are. So I would say that is essentially how accountable leaders can overcome cultural divides and use research in order to do that.
All right, thank you. The next question is for Ada. Understanding that humans are not robots and knowing that they have biases is important to creating behavior change, you said. But as human-computer interaction gains more currency in some industries, how do you think these teams of human computers will be able to track errors and biases in their future research projects or design?
Yeah, this is a really great question. There's so much to unpack there. It's interesting. It's an interesting question because we sometimes think about computers and machines and programs as unbiased and objective. They receive input, they do something with it, and then it produces an output. But more and more so, I think, we realize that humans are actually unintentionally coding their own biases into the smart machines. From the usage of skewed data inputs to skewed interactions as the machine might be learning. What comes to mind is it's a quick and popular example. If you recall, Microsoft's Tay. So Tay was a Twitter-based chatbot that was designed to learn from its interaction with users. And over time, funny enough, Tay was influenced by the user community to be very aggressively racist. What happened is that the community basically repeatedly tweeted offensive statements at Tay, and the system used those statements as the foundation for its own responses later on. And Tay only lived for 24 hours. It was shut down by Microsoft after it became, pretty aggressively racist. And what we can learn from this is that trying to recognize and catch the biases embedded in the machines is not enough. We have to start at the level of the human, understanding what biases we have, what belief systems we have, and know that we can unintentionally embed these into how the machines are programmed. And the other side of the coin really is to understand that users might perceive the machines and algorithms as more objective and unbiased than they really are. And in the past, this has resulted in dire consequences. If you recall, I think might have been 2008 when the stock market crashed momentarily because of algorithmic trading, where a computer basically automatically executes trades based on pre-programmed instructions. And so the question would be then, to really examine how might we reduce the risk that users would more blindly put their trust into an algorithm. So there's a lot to unpack, but what I would say as a takeaway is that ultimately we need to first start with understanding the human who codes the machines and codes the programs, and what biases are that exist in the human and how those are being fed into the smart machines.
Okay, Aaron Daddy, are you there?
I apologize. I wasn't. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Every once in a while, this question is for Liesl, please. Every once in a while, there are stories of global activists exercising untraditional leadership from outside the system, fostering a nonlinear growth and even disruption. Are there lessons here for external players, outsiders, or even influencers in trying to gain or maintain the trust of the public?
Thanks, Arundhati. So I think when it comes to activists, they're obviously leaders in their own rights, and you might even say very exemplary leaders. The key here, I think, is a lot of activists are not restrained in the typical ways that political and corporate leaders are. And I bypassed this in my presentation about accountability, because accountability, even if a person has a very accountable mindset, that can be limited and thwarted by the systems in place, either to put that person into power or select or hire that person, or whatever outcomes that leader is subject to, perhaps business outcomes, metrics, things like that. These external influences can restrain your typical corporate leader or your political leader. And an activist tends not to be restrained by these things, and even in cases where there are restraints, like legal, they may still try to supersede those. So I think that if there is any takeaway, it's not so much about that we don't want things around our leaders that shape or provide some sort of structure to their leadership, or how they are selected, how they're elected, how we evaluate them. But it's more so that it needs to work in tandem with the goal of creating positive outcomes for people. These things don't have to be at odds. And I think even, when throughout COVID-19, in the beginning, we heard this, and even probably still now, we heard that there was this dichotomy between of people and economy, right? And it doesn't really have to be that way. It's a mindset. And so I think that is the takeaway from activism and the type of leadership that you see with activism, that we can have that middle ground of really going for what needs to be done. But the external forces have to be shifted or reimagined or something in order to facilitate that.
Awesome, thank you. That's all we have time for in questions. We will follow up with other questions later post the event, and you will still get the roundups and summary highlights. If you enjoyed today's webinar, do consider engaging with your Insights Industry Association by becoming an RIA member, gaining access to exclusive opportunities and resources, fostering key industry discussions. It has truly been a great joy working with industry professionals like yourself as we push important ideas and thought leadership in this space. Also, differentiate your talent in this $80 billion plus marketplace by getting certified and adding credentials to your knowledge and expertise if you're a research professional. With that, thank you, everyone, and we look forward to connecting with you at our next webinar, if not sooner. And we wish you a great rest of your day.